Nobody know it's in I see you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for your patience and apology for the delay. This session is not that different from what we have been discussing in regard to narrative and Pan-Africanism. Actually, I think discussing Pan-Africanism and feminism is indeed a small nuance to adding on the extent of which the narrative affects women, but also women's leadership and role in advancing the Pan-African agenda on the spirit of Ubuntu. And today I'm joined by 4 amazing women. We will hear from Algeria, the Gambia, South Africa, Kenya, and these 4 are small realities of the variety and the amazing strength of our continent and the strength of the women of the continent. We will be joined by Rim, Genar, Precious, and Juliet, who will help us understanding the interlinkage between feminism and Pan-Africanism. So then together we can answer to the question, can we be Pan-Africanist without being feminist? Gender equality and feminism is at the core of MSTCDC, and as such is at the core of Cannes Festival as a Pan-African festival. We cannot leave a constituency out, which is a big constituency indeed, the one of women and girls. But also we would like to interrogate, is feminism something just for women, or is a state of mind? Is it so interlinked with the concept of Pan-Africanism to achieve the Africa we want? Yesterday, we have seen the Agenda 2060, the Agenda 2030, the SDG 5, the Aspiration 6, but foremost, how every day, as we are here promoting the Pan-African agenda, we embrace feminism. Before giving the floor to our panelists for the next 55 minutes, I would like to say that this is the start of a conversation. Tomorrow we will be hosting a gender theater. So we will be further investigating Pan-Africanism and feminism with a concept of intersectionality, which will be indeed already presented by our speakers. As we are here, I would like to say that women are at the forefront of the development agenda. And there are many stories we don't hear about. In the previous panel, indeed, we've been talking about narrative. And that narrative up to date is really preventing us as Africans to feel this sense, this continental sense. So I would like to shout out a bit about what's going on in Libya. It's been a decade of a humanitarian crisis and women are suffering deeply. But I would like also to highlight the strength of women in the Gambia, strength of the women in South Africa, strength of the women in Mozambique, the resilience on women in Tunisia. They are now protesting after 10 years of revolution. It's been 10 days despite the pandemic. But I would like also to shout out to all the people who are desperately trying to cross the Mediterranean and they are dying. And as we talk about these people as numbers, I would like to remember that these brave women and men have names, have stories. And it's up to us as Africans to uplift their names and to tell their stories in a straight and good narrative. And this is not different from the concept of feminism. And that is why I'm so happy today to have these four brave women. Thank you for accepting our invitation. I would like to invite Ngenar to quickly introduce yourself, and then I will give the floor to the other speakers.
Hi. Good afternoon, Sotfa. Good afternoon, everyone. I am Genaria Jeng. I am a feminist and a legal practitioner from the Gambia. I do developmental work and I also do some work in communications. It's a pleasure to be here, and I hope that we use this opportunity to exchange and share information over the next hour. Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much, Ngenar, and welcome. I would like to invite Juliet. Hi, Juliet.
Hi, Sotpa. Hi, everyone. It's such an honor to be in such a crowd and in this particular festival that really promotes a lot of art and culture as well. And just a brief introduction about myself. My name is Juliet Kimoto. I am a communication, advocacy, and policy expert. I do a lot of work around women and girls empowerment. I'm actually a founding member of the Gender is My Agenda campaign, Youth Young Women Network. And I also do a lot of youth empowerment activities across the continent. And I'm really happy to be part and parcel of this particular audience. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Juliet, and welcome. Hi, Precious.
Hi, how are you so far, and how's everyone? My name
Hi,
is,
well.
yes, thank you. My name is Precious Bando from the Republic of South Africa. I am a political and social activist, a Marxist feminist, a former student leader, and a writer too, and an avid reader, especially of African literature. So I believe in the liberation of women in general, but working class women in particular. And I'm looking forward to today's debate that debunks all issues of our feminism, our different strands and threads of feminism, and our identity as African people. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much and welcome. And lastly, hi, Rim.
Hi, Sotfa. Good afternoon or good morning, everyone. Bonjour, bonsoir. My name is Rim Menia. I am Algerian. I am a Pan-Africanist, feminist, and cultural activist. I studied architecture with focus on cultural heritage, and I work on the intersectionalities of feminism, culture, and identity in North Africa, with a special focus on the Amazigh identity in reference to the Amazigh people who are the original inhabitants of North Africa. I also joined the African Legal Think Tank on women's rights recently, and we are having a great journey. Thank you for hosting us, Sodfa, and we will have a great conversation.
Thank you very much, Reem. Welcome, and once again, thank you for accepting our invitation. We have audience here in presence, but also audience connected virtually watching our streaming. I would like to invite the audience to also interact through our hashtag. This is a great opportunity also for all of us to connect and to keep the conversation going forward beyond these 50 minutes. So I would like to start with the first question, and I suggest that Ngenar responds first, and then we take it from there. The first question is, what's feminism, and why can't we disconnect Pan-Africanism and feminism? Ngenar, over to you.
So I'm going to try to keep this very, very short. I think it's very interesting trying to talk about feminism and Pan-Africanism. And in my opinion, there's definitely no way you can separate the two. The reason being, if you look at the history of both the movements, so for example, the feminist movement, which is the fight for women's rights and for women to be treated as human beings, basically, and to be equal to men and their interests as well. Um, it started quite a long time ago, but if you're looking at history, a lot of people would like to say, oh, the feminism movement started maybe in the 60s, 70s with the American, civil rights movement. But as we're growing in this movement, and I myself am growing in this movement, I'm doing some reading and finding out, you tend to see that that is incorrect, and that feminism, especially for Black women, has been going on for the longest period of time. I think the furthest that I could probably trace back, especially me being a Muslim, would be making sure that young infanticide or killing of young girls is not happening. So feminism has been here for the longest period of time. But if you also look at Pan-Africanism, which started also a very long time, but just looking at the history of it, then you'll find the interconnectedness. Now, I'm going to try to keep this very, very short, but how Black and brown bodies have been treated over a period of time, you tend to notice where the intersection comes in. So for example, with slavery and how Black women were treated, basically to be incubators of, breeding more slaves. And there are a lot of women that were very much against this. And when slavery ended, we moved to colonialism, where there was this, let's say, hypersexualization of Black women, which still continues to this age and has contributed a lot to what I would describe as white feminism, and the way our feminism has become very, very distinct from white feminism. And the problem for me is, when you look at the times of colonialism and how Black women were still being treated, even though the slavery era was over, the hypersexualization, the notion that Black women were being protected from Black men and being abused, and that they were not, quote unquote, civilized, and that they did not deserve, let's say, some of the privileges that they were supposed to have, rights and privileges they were supposed to have. And a lot of feminism came up during that time as well. If you look at the movement across the globe, a lot of people started making a lot of noise for the rights of women, and especially Black women. And when you ask audiences about feminism and Pan-Africanism, Pan-Africanism to be specific, you would hear a lot of people talk about men in the Pan-African movement. So you'll hear things like W.E.B. Du Bois, Marcus Garvey, things like that. But you'll never hear people, well, maybe you'll hear a few people talk about Ida B. Wells or Marcus Garvey's wife. These are people that contributed a lot to the Pan-Africanist movement. And even in their contributions, they were specifically focused on the rights of women, especially Black women, to make sure that their voices were heard, as opposed to the intentional erasure that was taking place over time. Do I think feminism and Pan-Africanism can be separated? No, you can't be a Pan-African without being a feminist. If you really do care for Black people across the globe, Black women who make up quite a huge number of that and do contribute a lot towards that population, need to be listened to and they need to be heard. So if you're a Pan-African, you need to be feminist. That's just not like part of the thing for me. And if you're a feminist also, you need to be Pan-African, because you can't claim to be a feminist, but then you tend to ignore the voices of Black women. That's just not how it works. And in the movement that we're doing, which is the intersection, you can't leave one group behind. They just have to go together. I will stop there because I know other people will want to contribute. So And that was a very, very
Thank you very much.
smutty summary of Pan-Africanism and feminism in 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Ingenar. And actually, I think you laid down points that for sure the other speakers will take. And some of them have been already mentioned in the previous conversation about narrative, the incorrect narrative, but also men in the Pan-African movement, and recently uplifting the role of men or highlighting just the role of men in the current social movements. This has happened in the past decade. We have seen women contribution, but yet women rights were put at the end of the agenda. Let's first achieve the other rights, and then we shall see if we are able to speak about women's rights. And very often women contribution is simply not mentioned and not recognized. But foremost, you can't be a Pan-African without being a feminist. And with these words, I think I'll give the floor to Juliet to respond to the same question, what's feminism and why can't we disconnect Pan-Africanism and feminism? But I also invite our audience, especially the one virtually using the hashtag, to respond to this question as well. Juliet, over to you.
Thank you, Sodpa, and that's quite an interesting reflection from Genar. And just to add on to what Genar just mentioned about feminism, when you look at feminism and Pan-Africanism, those are, yes, two definitions, but they can't be really separated. And anytime we talk about feminism, I feel like a lot is misinterpreted in this essence, that most of the people think that feminism is about the women being more superior than men, when actually, or we are belittling the men. That's the wrong definition of feminism. In my understanding, feminism is all about, challenging the systematic inequalities that have seen women put in a suppressed spot compared to men, and also the aspect of ensuring that we have, as women and men, we all have equal opportunities. We all have the same place and space to be able to explore our potential, either regardless of our gender, and also being able to speak out without being, profiled or, tagged in a wrong way to that effect. And then when you look at also the aspect of Pan-Africanism, the first thing that would hit Africans when we talk about Pan-Africanism is recalling where we've come from in terms of our freedom, in terms of the opportunities that we were suppressed for. For instance, when we think about the colonial days, Africans were denied a lot of resources, and we couldn't get access to so many things that we needed to get access to, or we felt that we did not have the space to govern ourselves as Africans. And when the movement of Pan-Africanism started, and it's important to note that at the starting point, we saw a lot of men actually being the ones at the forefront in pushing the spirit of Pan-Africanism, including some of the first presidents of African countries. But then I feel because the place where the woman was put at in such extensive patriarchal system in Africa, women did not have the opportunity to be like the frontiers of Pan-Africanism. And you'd see this, even though in their own spaces, they could contribute. I mean, we have very incredible names when we talk about freedom fighters in Africa. We have, I know in Kenya, we speak about Wangua Makeri as being one of the women who really drove a lot of change on the ground and challenging the status quo on the place of women in the communities. And I feel that in those days when Pan-Africanism was just starting, women's power was just confined within the homes and within the economic sphere of the communities, as opposed to actually the men's sphere, where they could enjoy the political, discourse, they could enjoy the decision-making platforms that were there for them and things like that. But anytime we think about Pan-Africanism, we should be able to think about our aspirations as Africans. Where do we want to see ourselves? Do we want to dispel all forms of inequalities? Do we want to mold change agents? Do we want to be self-sufficient as Africans and as a continent? When we think within those lines, then we are better placed to plan how to create a revolution where we are inclusive of all sexes, we create an equal platform, we make all resources available to all, and we are considerate of the factors that limit one sex over the other. And in so doing, we are able to mesh the aspect of feminism and Pan-Africanism in the sense that you're creating an opportunity for women to enjoy what they did not usually enjoy before, or to be able to be in a space of influence that would really help the entire Africa to grow in all spheres, socioeconomic, political, and all that. So that to me is my understanding and the reasoning behind this. No need to separate feminism and Pan-Africanism. It's just about challenging the initial systems that really put women in a more suppressed spot compared to what really they can do as individuals, as a group, and as key members of the society. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Juliet. What comes out from your intervention, it's first of all challenging the systemic inequalities. And I think this is strictly connected to the concept of intersectionality, race, class, age, among other factors, and of course, gender. And it's extremely important that we remain conscious of the multiple layers of inequalities, and most importantly, how inequality is really systemic. And as such, how in our Pan-African vision, how together we can be inclusive and conscious of the multiple realities. It could be from rural to urban, people with disabilities, and many other factors. How do we embrace this sense of inclusivity? And most importantly, the misinterpretation of what's feminism. I think up to date, still there are many people who look at feminism as something very negative, as this radical, which, by the way, radical like comes from root, and root in Latin, it's in Latin means root, so it's nothing negative. But by the time some misinterpretation brought a misunderstanding on the way we look at feminism and that the feminist movement. So thank you, Juliet, for your contribution. I would like to give the floor now to Precious to respond to the question.
Hi, Sofa. I think I have 4 points to make. I have structured my contribution and offering to the debate into 4 points. Firstly, I would like to indicate that I don't like how the debate is going, because I feel like we don't want to really bring out the contrasts and the real tensions that exist between Pan-Africanism and feminism. To want to reconcile these tensions is not to mean the tensions do not exist. And I think we need to be honest enough to do that in the debate. So the 4 points that I have, the first one for me is Pan-Africanism must center women's roles, and we must interrogate how the evolution of Pan-Africanist discourse informs both, gender and sex. The issue of gender and sex in Africa is very important today, and how African thought has developed, but disregarding the position of women in African society and its effect. You have today where African, countries have leaders and presidents that refuse to acknowledge and respect sexuality and the evolving nature of sexuality from other in our societies, that those who are queer and belong to the LGBTQIA plus community are imprisoned in African countries, and presidents of Africa firmly speak against that. And these are seen to be great minds and thinkers who shape what Pan-Africanist thought is. So for me, we need to confront the gendered contours of Pan-Africanism. And also, we can't just agree on what our leaders are doing. Unity and solidarity of Africans is very important, but we have to redefine what we need to do as radicals and also as those who term themselves as revolutionaries today, is in fact to redefine Pan-Africanist thought and praxis, because the Pan-Africanism that is backward is very dominant. The Pan-Africanism that refuses to acknowledge the multi-identities of African people is very dominant in the space, and it has to be confronted for what it is than to just say there are no differences, we agree with everything. And of course, like I mentioned, there are points of harmony, there are points of contradictions, and we need to separate them. The second point that I want to make is that in harmonizing them, and I think that's where everyone else is focusing in the main, to want to harmonize Pan-Africanism and feminism, but in harmonizing them, we must be honest enough to ourselves to say we're trying to build alternative identity from the colonial master and the capitalist master. We must locate feminism in this context. So we must locate feminism in the context of building a new form of identity from patriarchal colonialism. So the hierarchies that exist around race, national, nationality, and Pan-Africanism, that Pan-Africanism wants to challenge, should take into consideration gender and sexuality. And that's where the intersectional part comes in. And that's why it's important that all of us actually become advocates of intersectionality for what it is, that African thinking cannot be thinking that packages race, nationality, and leaves behind sex and sexuality and gender. We cannot allow that. So this can actually, if we do that and we insist in that kind of narrative, we can try to reconcile the dominant tensions that exist between Pan-Africanism and feminism. And this will be the progressive link that brings the two together. So intersectionality becomes the way of thinking for all of us who are activists and struggling in the space. And my third point therefore goes to we need to speak more around decolonization, because deconstructing decolonial ideologies of superiority and privilege or Western thought and ideas is very important for both Pan-Africanism and feminism. Dismantling the structures that enhance patriarchal capitalism has to be seen as, entrenching, enhancing, asserting Black women's ideas in Africa, and also confronting the unbalanced power relations and dynamics and affirming sexuality in Africa. So that's very, very important. So for me, when you look at Pan-Africanism and look at feminism, we'll not be doing justice if we don't look at the colonial past that we come from as African people, but also capitalism and neoliberalism, imperialism today, because as an African, poor young woman that I am, I look at all these forms of identities that make me and my own lived realities that I cannot choose or separate them, but I must understand them for what they are. My last point is just to say, maybe we need to have a discussion where we are not naming things, because, you know, I had a discussion earlier with one decorated academic, African thinker, African radical feminist, Dr. Kanyisile Chabalala Litchfield, a writer and a knowledge producer, you know, an advocate of Pan-Africanism. And we were discussing today's discussion. And the first thing that she asked me and makes my fourth point was, why do you want to juxtapose or to contrast feminism and Pan-Africanism? And then she says, but also in Africa, our issue has been that we have not given things names. We have not given things names. So feminism has existed from primitive stages of African society, but it hasn't been called feminism. But the word feminism, the term, and, you know, the kind of buzz thinking around what is feminist thought is attached to Western ideology, the very ideology that we are saying as part of our decolonial construct we want to undo. And the mistake that we make is we think because we're undoing Westernization, therefore we have to undo what we call feminism. And yet, the shortfall of that is that feminist thinking and feminist ideology has actually existed before time in the evolution of African society, but it has not been called feminist. It has not been called feminist because she argues that Africans, in fact, have not named things, and they looked at naming things as part of stereotyping, and that it's you know, it's part of prejudice and stereotyping. So then she says, now, when you want to put the two like this, what are you talking about? You have to be able to make clear distinctions of such things, but also to look at feminism as it is, because I'm a Marxist feminist, and I believe, and I know that there are different stands. I don't believe, I know there are different strands and threads of feminism. So that distinction of the different threads of feminism and strands, and where will be our point of differences in our different forms of feminism, despite our common articulation and agreement on the liberation of women, is very important also to factor in this kind of conversation. So our conversation went on and on, where she spoke about the fluidity also of gender in African context, but how knowledge production by women in Africa, or by the oppressed in Africa, has in fact been undermined. And she speaks as a Black African academic, where who's in knowledge production. How Pan-Africanist thought itself inherently has been produced by men who never respected the woman question, or the question of women emancipation and liberation. So you have a case where you have great African minds, great thinkers, great writers that have produced knowledge and theories that we still look at today. But when you look at their writing, you look at their thinking, until today, you see that they haven't in fact expressed anything on the suffrage of African women or the emancipation of women. So I raise all these issues, the sharp contradictions that are between the two, so that we don't just become a boring conversation where we speak about how the two cannot be separated, where the two have become a point, in fact, that locates women differently in society, and that is to be lifted up. The issue of sexuality, the issue of genital mutilation in Africa, the issue of corruption, corrupt African leaders in Africa, the issue of ageism, old African leaders that don't want to leave power because they don't believe that young Africans can lead, is also like something that we need to bring up. So all this has got some African thinking, some African, ideologies that justify certain inequalities and exploitations that exist in our continent. But at the end of the day, what we must agree on, that we have to be intersectional and that we have to continue to strive for the total liberation of all people, and of women and working class women in particular. Thank you very much, Comrade Program Director.
Thank you very much, Precious. I think thank you for raising these points, which I believe will guide the point of view from Reem, as her focus and work is indeed on colonization. As you said, how can we have this conversation if we don't look at our colonial past, if we don't look at imperialism, if we don't look at capitalism, if we don't embrace a full intersectional lens? So I would like to give the floor to Reem, so then we can move on to the second question. Reem, you have heard the contribution from our different panelists, and I think it's not coincidental that I left North Africa as the last contribution, as up to date, we still believe that North Africa is not even part of the continent. So please, can you give us this perspective, starting from North Africa, and then what does it mean being Pan-Africanist, feminist in North Africa?
Thank you very much, Sudfa. And I would like to say it once more, because I repeat it every time I am invited somewhere as a North African. I perceive North Africa as in Africa and not as in any other conception. And I thank Precious for her intervention, which I find very, very real and very strong. I would also like to join what Ngenar has said. Feminism in Africa has always been here. In North Africa, for example, from Dihiya to El Kahina to Fadman Sumer to Fatima Al Fihriya or Sayyid Al Hurra to more recently Nawal Al Sa'dawi, Fatma Al Mernisi, Muna Tahawi, feminism has always been here. It was not invented. However, it became a tradition. And before starting, I would like to give tribute to my grandmother, Baya, for her feminism, even if she didn't name it as such. Je veux rendre hommage à ma grand-mère Baya, qui était elle-même féministe, même si elle l'a pas nommé ça comme féminisme. In North Africa, and I think that this is duplicated to the entire continent, women are struggling with a double sharpened knife. We have cultural crisis from a side versus patriarchal conception and misunderstanding. In North Africa, this translates into two captivating words. The first one is aib, which means in modern standard Arabic, what deviates or what differs from what is considered as normal. And the other word is hshuma, which is in North African Darija or the dialects of North Africa, which translates to shameful or scandalous. So the habit of qualifying acts of aib or hshuma generally refers to the fact that it is the consequence of unargued societal practices. And this leads to the incapacity of these practices to evolve, which makes the contemporary space, which is dedicated to women in North Africa, drastically heterogeneous. However, the narrative about women in the contemporary public space, for example, is biased through patriarchal conceptions that are incapable of evolving. And this is why there is a need for feminism and for feminisms. For me personally, I think that there is no exact definition to feminism, and I believe that we shall talk about feminisms in the plural form if we want to contextualize the struggles. However, these feminisms have a common goal, which is women liberation and emancipation. And accordingly, I would like to go back to what Sodfa told me once, and I quote, I don't want to be equal to men. I want to have what I deserve as a woman. And I think that this defines feminism as a social, cultural, and economic construct that works towards reattributing, attributing, resetting, and setting women where they deserve to be. The ideals of Pan-Africanism, to join the conversation about feminism and Pan-Africanism, have guided African struggles. Those struggles of the African people against colonial, first of all, and then post-colonial oppression for much of the 20th century. And the most dangerous oppression is the perpetuation of patriarchy and misogyny in colonial and post-colonial practices that are still existing in Africa and which affect especially women. Pan-Africanism should be a very inclusive concept that tackles different aspects of our sociocultural and economic struggles as Africans and as African women more precisely. And if today we want to ensure a continuation of that traditional struggle, as well as a renewed push toward freedom, towards justice, towards dignity, that responds to the particular challenges that are posed by capitalism, as Precious has said, we cannot disconnect feminism and Pan-Africanism. There is absolutely no Pan-Africanism without feminism, as there is no Pan-Africanism without fighting racism, for example. There is no Pan-Africanism without fighting economic inequalities. Pan-Africanism is a struggle and is at the same time the struggle of multiple struggles. And I would like to quote actually Thomas Sankara. I will say it first in French and then I will translate it. He said, La révolution et la libération des femmes vont de pair. Et ce n'est pas un acte de charité ou un élan d'humanisme que de parler de l'émancipation des femmes. C'est une nécessité fondamentale pour le triomphe et la révolution. Les femmes portent sur elles l'autre moitié du ciel, which translates to revolution and women's liberation go hand in hand. And it is not an act of charity or an impulse of humanism to speak of the emancipation of women. It is fundamental necessity for triumph and revolution. Women carry the other half of the sky with them. So there is no Pan-Africanism without feminism because humans must coexist on the basis of dignity, equity, respect. And this is where we should adopt an approach of feminist Pan-Africanism, which offers a critical examination of structural, of religious, cultural, legal limitations that are imposed on African women today and expectations of conformity that come with these acts. To conclude, I think that we must be aware that we need to adopt intersectional lenses of feminist Pan-Africanism, as it is a key not only in the analysis of women's struggles, but it is also an analysis of wider African struggles for justice, for dignity, for equality, for land, for water, and even correction of narratives. So to conclude, there is no Pan-Africanism without feminism, and this is a fact. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Reem. I think you have quoted Mona Tahawi. She's an Egyptian journalist, and I think she found the best way to describe patriarchy. So according to Mona, and I would like to present this way of describing it, she thinks that patriarchy is an octopus, and the head of the octopus is patriarchy, and then all the tentacles are transphobia, homophobia, racism. And so the more these tentacles, you see the different structures of inequalities and how this fuel the head of the octopus. I think we can summarize all the answers to then move to the second question, although you have already responded to it. Starting from African knowledge, I think is extremely important. And this gets also in the previous session. To which extent are we connected to African produced knowledge? But to which extent also are we aware of African history? We are talking about decolonization, But are we aware of the colonization on the countries in the continent? And if yes, to which extent? Every time people talk about feminism and Western ideology, I contradict that. I come from Tunisia. It's a country that had civil rights even before France, our oppressor. As soon as Bourguiba, our leader, came into power, he gave the right to abolish polygamy, to get divorced, to access abortion. So all these are aspects that we tend to forget, and we end up relegating feminism, which is coming from a Western ideology. And I think when we mention African knowledge, and then we all agree that we cannot discuss of Pan-Africanism without feminism. We cannot do so without an intersectional perspective and analysis. We cannot do so without being inclusive. Then my second question is, at this point, recognizing the linkage between Pan-Africanism and feminism, how Pan-Africanism and feminism will drive the change and transform the continent in the Africa we want and we dream of. So I would like to give the floor to Ngenar to respond to the question.
So thank you for the question, Sotfa. I think Reem mentioned quite a huge chunk of what I was going to say for this part, but thank you to Precious as well, because she raised quite a few points that I wanted to raise in this for this question. I think the first thing we need to recognize when we are trying to move forward in the Pan-Africanism and feminism space is to recognize some of the problems that we have in between. So for example, if you look at the start of the Pan-Africanist movement or the nationalist movement in Africa, one of the biggest mistakes that our leaders made was that they inherited a lot of the patriarchal values that were here when the colonizers were here. So instead of bringing women together into the movement and putting them in the forefront with them, they decided to continue with, men being in the forefront and being political, while women were relegated to the back. And what they did was support the men or be at home to take care of the family. And for me, that is where the problem started. But going back to the intersection, which is that Pan-Africanism is here to break down all forms of oppression. And Reem mentioned this, whether it's economic oppression, capitalism, fighting for women, basically just deconstructing the whole concept of white imperialism and white superiority. This needs to be done in the context of feminism. And I agree with Precious here again. If we're trying to move forward as Black people and people of African descent, and I apologize for the noise. I'm at home, so there's a lot of things happening. If we're trying to deconstruct all of these things and move forward, there needs to be a coherent way that we move forward. We can't just have say that we're nationalists and we're Pan-Africanists, but we do not bring women to the forefront. Studies have shown time and time again that not only do women have a lot to contribute, but women are very effective in the work that we do. And Precious also mentioned this, in that we need to include all women. It's not just women in the binary gender construct of male and female, but then every other person who identifies as woman, and despite their sexuality, everyone needs to be brought on board. For me, the problems that I see, just as highlighted by Precious again, our movements have sort of become very, very disconnected, even though they shouldn't be. But once we find a way to get it back together, then everything's going to work, right? I think this is what we need to work towards, is that our leaders, being nationalists and Pan-Africanists, need to be feminists. You don't need to separate the two for it to work. There's quite a big intersection amongst the two, and that is where the problem is, that if we do not try to fix that, then it doesn't work. Like, Reem said, and I said this earlier, I feel like Reem has already said everything that I wanted to say, so I'm trying not to repeat her words or anything that Precious has said. But yes, there are quite a few gaps in the movements, but if we look at the different intersectionalities that we have and then we work through it, bringing feminism and Pan-Africanism and making sure that the intersection works fine, then we could move forward as African people and people of Black descent globally.
Thank you very much, Ngenar. I would like to give the floor to Juliet.
Thank you, Sodfa. And just the way I envision that we can drive change through Pan-Africanism and feminism is one, we must have some kind of strong foundation, and which I believe we have that. One, through the solidarity of the African bodies and the African people, first identifying ourselves as Africans, identifying ourselves as a powerhouse for development, and identifying ourselves as problem solvers of our own problems in Africa. And second of all, it's also the aspect of knowing what are our aspirations. So we know who we are, where do we want to go? And figuring that out means we need to be conscious of the kind of leadership and structure we need to lay ground for that kind of progress to be achieved. And one way of doing it is ensuring whoever is driving change, right from the community level or the grassroots level to the political high end, like organs such as the African Union, we do have representation of women, representation of all diverse groups that are involved in driving change, so that the whole idea of Pan-Africanism is better fulfilled. It's also identifying and being really deliberate about the issues that we find ourselves in as Africans, and the things that really stop us from moving forward. For instance, we've talked about extensively about inequalities, for instance, and the lack of consideration of different special groups, including women and girls, in some of these resources, access to opportunities and rights as well. But also, it also goes beyond that and looks at what kind of plans and what kind of management are we putting in place to, move from step 1 to 2? Are we having like proper accountability mechanisms to check ourselves on progress? And I am sorry to say, and we all know corruption is everywhere, but we seem to have so much in Africa for ourselves. And then also the fact that we also need to think about, sorry, there's some noise on the background. Some noise on the background. Gustavine, I think, yeah, there you go. So it's also thinking about the kind of management we want to run Africa. We would like to see run Africa, and it's a management of, it involves integrity, it involves transparency, it involves respect for cultures, it involves inclusivity, and all that, dynamic that plays a role and a part in development in the continent. And that's the only way we can really identify with Pan-Africanism. It's also to know that anytime we talk about feminism, let's think through what we have failed, how we have failed our women, our girls before, and looking at how we failed them, how can we now move from that and now consider them part and parcel of development, part and parcel of decision making in all spheres of the continent. And so that would be really important to drive change and also invest heavily. As a continent, we need not look like we always want to borrow everything from outside, when we can actually invent our own And if we are keen enough on and sincere enough, we can actually manage what our resources, right, to ensure that we achieve the dream of a self-sufficient, united Africa that is free from neocolonialism, that is free from all those negative issues that we've mentioned here today, such as, slavery, such as, sorry, I'm having a moment, such as slavery, such as, obstruction of justice, such as obstruction of freedom of speech and things like that. So I believe a lot of it has to be centered on the goodwill of Africans and their leadership, on the solidarity of all Africans, regardless of where you sit on the table, whether it's at the grassroots level or at the Pan-African level, just to mention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Juliet. So before giving the word to Precious and Reem, I would like to ask the colleagues if they could check the Zoom chat to see if there is any question for our speakers, as we are wrapping up in less than 10 minutes. So while the colleagues are checking the chat, I will give quickly the floor to Precious and then Reem to respond to the question, and then we see if someone here in the present audience and on Zoom would like to make a comment or ask a question to any of our panelists. Thank you. Precious, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair. I would like to, I think, also recognize, Chair, the beautiful inputs that are being made by all the panelists that are speaking ahead of us, the two panelists that spoke ahead of us. But I think the Africa that we want to build is one where women, children, and all marginalized and oppressed communities are able to live freely and to express their talents and also all their freedoms. This means our fight against capitalism, our fight for decolonization continues. It means continuously expressing ourselves without fear or favor against homophobia, against xenophobia in Africa, and against tribalism, which has broken a lot of African nations. I would also want to say we have this kind of conversation when, the African condition is very bad. The gap between the poor and the rich is growing in the continent, and our natural resources are being looted. They are being taken away by the West. Now, we can't speak liberation if we don't fight about, commanding the economy of our continent and building a united Africa that uses its resources for its children and for its offspring. So what's happening in the Congo, has to be fought and exposed. What's happening in all rich African countries where they are all at war and women are used as instruments of war has to be spoken against. And, I take this opportunity also just to raise the plight of Zimbabwean students that are arrested in Zimbabwe. Student activists have been serving time in Zimbabwe. It's soon that we saw on the news that the journalist that was unfairly arrested for freedom of speech has been released. But it's not just a Zimbabwean phenomenon, it's an African phenomenon. Recently, the elections in Uganda, a young African man stands up, and what we need to do, especially us from liberation movements, is to call out our own liberation movements that have mutated to become, in fact, political parties and have given up their own liberation mandates, that we are blackmailed. When there's impunity, when there's, laws that in fact take away from the people and so on, we are supposed to just stick on and say these are liberation movements, and any voice that speaks against them is seen as a puppet of the West. But it is liberation movements that are oppressing African people. It is liberation movements in power that are in fact refusing people to live freely and express themselves freely sexually. It is liberation movement that continue and, you know, multiply, reproduce, and reinforce the exploitation and oppression of women in all forms. So all these things have to come out, and it's us young Africans that have to speak out. We you know, we remember the people of Western Sahara right now. The people of Western Sahara are still oppressed. The people of Swaziland, women rights in Swaziland are difficult. In that country, women cannot express themselves. The people of Southern Sudan, and all warring and struggling nations of Africa and the world. And we need to remember them and to say, as women, if we come together, maybe in platforms of this nature, you know, maybe we can make a difference. In South Africa, this is the year of Charlotte Maxeke, the founding president of the ANC Women's League, a woman that recruited most men that later became presidents of the very liberation movement and ruling party today. It's the 150th anniversary of the birth of President Charlotte Maxeke. Now, when you remember the contribution, both, you know, theoretically and otherwise, of a great woman like Charlotte Maxeke, you remember that there are many in Africa, like in Zambia. You have the Florence Chikamonega, you have also Amina in Nigeria, Makeda in Ethiopia, Yao Asantewa in Ghana, and many other strong women that have stood the test of time in Africa. It means we have the shoulders to stand on as young African women. It means it has been done before. It's not new in Africa that women have stood up against the odds and have put their lines on the, have put their bodies on the lines and have sacrificed to want to liberate their people. It has been done by African people. So we need to speak out also, so far. The AU, we want a fighting AU. We want an AU whose legitimacy and presence we feel across the continent. We don't want a toothless AU. We don't want an AU that keeps quiet when our resources are taken away, when our countries are looted and exploited, when capitalism and imperialism entrenches itself in Africa. That's not the kind of AU that I dream of as a young activist and revolutionary of today. So let's continue these platforms. Let's continue these debates. Let's continue to take the message and to inspire more African people. With that, we can build the Africa that we want. But at the end of the day, let's have revolution. One day as African people, let's say enough is enough. Let's stand up, defend ourselves, our being, all our identities, and our continent. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Precious. And indeed, let's keep having this conversation. I would like to invite the people to keep conversating using our hashtag, but also tomorrow from 2 to 4, we will be having a gender theater while investigating intersectionality. So I would like to ask everyone connected to join us tomorrow as well. In the meantime, to keep conversating in our social media channels. So I would like to give the floor to Reem as the last contribution before we wrap up. Reem, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Sodfa. First of all, I believe that a feminist Pan-Africanist approach will let us, first of all, dismantle the misconceptions and then reset the facts in order to correct the narrative. And this will lead us to drive the change and build the Africa we want. However, I think that we must be conscious that we are confronted to some facts. First of all, the digital divide is a barrier towards women emancipation in Africa. Second, movements building among people in Africa is threatened by a loss of continuum of the Pan-African struggle and accordingly the feminist approach of Pan-Africanism. The third point is the fact that the grassroots are the ones who are suffering the most, but at the same time, they are the ones who are doing the job. And last thing, we must be aware and conscious about the vulnerability that can result from socioeconomic and gender disparities and which endangers the civic rights in Africa. And we have seen it amid the COVID-19 pandemic that we are currently facing. And there will be other economic and sociocultural pandemics, but also political dysfunctions that we may face in the future. And we must be conscious that we are vulnerable towards this. However, our resilience, our creativity, our innovation, our resistance as women, as feminists, as Africans, led me to conclude that, first of all, feminist Pan-Africanism is a political act because it can face the dictatorships all around the continent. And we have examples from the Tunisian 2011 revolution or the Algerian 2019 Hirak and the Sudanese 2019 revolution as well, which I believe are the best examples where we can see the feminist frontliners achieving. So feminist Pan-Africanism is a political act towards political freedom. The second fact is that feminism is also an economic shift because it can ensure economic prowess, but especially economic recovery on the continent and ensure our economic freedom. And last of all, and I think it is the most important point, because for me, culture is the driving points of all our struggles. Feminist Pan-Africanism is a culture that will result in identity and culture correction all over Africa, which will let us fight misconceptions around women, around feminisms, around patriarchy, and around misogyny. So there is no Pan-Africanism without feminism, and only a feminist Pan-African approach can ensure that we fight our struggles and that we can transform Africa and build the Africa we want. And thank you very much to all the panelists for your strong voices, and thank you, Sodfa, for moderating this debate.
Shukran, Reem. Thank you, Reem. Thank you, all the panelists, for taking the time and join us. We are 1 minute late, but I'm kind of satisfied. We remain on time. I would like to thank you for giving us your time, for your valuable contribution, for bringing into light certainly aspects that we will mainstream tomorrow. So that is why I'm inviting the audience to please use the hashtag icon. This will also help us as we are collecting your contribution, your ideas, your ambition for the Africa we want, the Africa we desire, as we put together the report and the People's Manifesto, which is your manifesto. And tomorrow, please connect in our social media channels online to follow our gender theater from 2 to 4 p.m. East African time, but also in the long-term journey. Don't forget to visit the MSTCDC website, as you can see the work of the Gender Equality and Feminist Leadership Reference Group. Beyond that, the work of the entire ActionAid Federation. I would like to thank you all for giving us your time, and thank you for your attention. Thank you very much, Reem and Genar, Juliet and Precious. Thank you.